Hi, everyone, and welcome to this fourth session of Chatham House Global Governance Forum. This session today, we will focus on the spaces enabled, allowed, authorized, and that are explored by diverse peoples, rural peoples, and the space in which diverse forests would be having in plans like the NDCs, plans like development plans at national level. And I'm honored to be joined today by Paige Langer, who joins from the US, also Leon Jorge Castanos from Mexico, Marion Kalenga, now based in Congo, and also we'll be having Jose Ilanga from DRC or Congo. My name is Thiago. I'll be your chair for the session. And just recapping some of the housekeeping dynamics. Well, first of all, there is interpretation available in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. I would encourage you, even the English speakers, to move to interpretation, since some of the presentations will be in French and Spanish. Another point is that this meeting is on the record. So please note that the video recordings will be shared afterwards with the broader community. And of course, we are looking forward to the Q&A session. So please do start adding your questions on the Q&A box. And you can use also the upvotes with the thumbs up function there if you want to encourage us to pick the question you like the most. And of course, you can ask the questions in the language of your choosing. So for now, I just want to highlight some of the key elements of today's session. So first of all, we are talking about participation. We are talking about spaces, forums, where decisions are made. We are talking about diverse forests in the sense that we want to understand how national governments and the international arena has been considering different kinds of forests and land use strategies. For example, what is the room for agroforestries? What is the room for timber plantations? What is the room for monocultures? What is the room for sustainable forest management? And you can continue the list, but we want to know from the speakers, what is the room in such policy frameworks for diverse forests? And the second element is to consider what is the room for rural peoples in the land use planning strategies. So in the previous panels, we talked about grassroots direct participation, mediation through NGOs, governments, and some private-led initiatives. And today we will appreciate a bit of how these considerations have been taken into account in NDCs and other nationally led development or any kind of other agricultural plan, social plan, etc., in the policy mix affecting land use. So I'll introduce each speaker one by one. So Paige Langer is going to be the first, and she will give us an overview of NDCs. She'll explain what an NDC is. Sorry, I've been failing to do that, but Paige will have the platform to do so. So Paige is an associate of the World Resource Institute, and she works for the Global Forest Program. The WI is a very close partner of Chatham House for a long time. And she focuses on realizing the potential of tropical forests to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, also working on finance from public and private sources. She also works with WRI's climate program on the promotion of forests and land use activities in international, domestic, and corporate climate strategies. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Political Sciences and International Relations from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Master in Public Policy from George Washington University. page. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tiago, and thank you to Chatham House for having me today. Everyone can hear me fine? Great. So as Tiago mentioned, I'm Paige Langer, an associate at the Global Forest Program at World Resources, based in Washington, DC. So a little early here this morning, but happy to join. I'll be kicking off today's session with a little bit more of a global perspective on what types of forest sector policies have been included in the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, and how close these current commitments can get us to achieving some of the goals of the Paris Agreement. And then finally, a little bit about how countries can look to some of these national climate plans when looking to build back better with their COVID economic recovery packages. Next slide, please. So first, I want to provide a quick overview of the types of forest sector targets and policies that have been included in countries' nationally determined contributions. This graphic is a little bit dated because it covers NDCs submitted prior to 2020, but it's still pretty representative of the types of policies and targets that countries have included to date. As you can see, reforestation, forest conservation, as well as sustainable land and forest management are some of the most common policies that countries have committed to in their NDCs. For example, the Ivory Coast has committed to establish a payment incentive scheme for environmental services to encourage village reforestation and conservation of natural forest in rural areas. Another example is Bolivia, which has committed to increase its forest area using an integrated and sustainable community management approach. However, despite the numerous and diverse benefits that forest systems can provide, many countries have not yet made full use of their potential or lack the needed implementation plans, which could result in missing some substantial opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in cost-effective ways. Next slide, please. The type of policy or measure that countries choose to implement is very important, as different types of forests and nature-based solutions have different benefits in terms of their greenhouse gas mitigation protocol potential, their adaptation and biodiversity co-benefits, or risks to food security. As you can see here, some of the activities in the upper left, such as reduced deforestation and forest degradation, have high mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity benefits, where in contrast, some of the nature-based solutions in the lower part of the figure, such as large-scale bioenergy or afforestation, might be able to provide some sort of climate benefit, but have negative impacts on both biodiversity and food security. As with most policy solutions, the specific national and subnational context is going to be very important when determining the appropriate combination of forest activities, as I'm sure we'll hear more about later in this presentation. Next slide, please. While not all countries have yet submitted their updated NDCs, a recently published report from the World Wildlife Fund analyzed these newly submitted NDCs up through June of this year and found a positive trend in countries incorporating forest and nature-based solutions. The report reviewed 55 NDCs and found that nearly all of them did reference nature-based solutions in some way or another. Of these enhanced NDCs, 34 parties improved the integration of nature-based solutions compared to previous versions. However, as we can see here, progress was uneven across income levels, with some lower income countries having a decline in forest sector actions, which is particularly concerning, as many of these are forest-rich nations. Nature-based solutions did feature more strongly in the higher and upper middle income nations, NDCs, indicating that there is a significant need for technical and financial support and capacities, which many low-income countries currently lack. Next slide, please. Here, if we zoom out a bit, we can look at the current status of NDC submissions to see if we are on track globally to meet some of our climate goals. To date, 91 parties, including the EU, representing 42% of global emissions, have submitted an updated NDC. However, as we can see, many countries have not yet made a submission, including large emitting countries such as China and India, as well as some forest-rich countries such as Indonesia and some in the Congo Basin, which again, we'll hear about later this morning, afternoon. Next slide, please. The emission reduction commitments of NDCs are not currently on track to be achieving our Paris Agreement goals. The IPCC report that came out in February found that the newly submitted NDCs resulted only in a 2.8% emissions reduction decline compared to their first NDC submissions. And while there have been some key countries that have put forward commitments since, in order to limit the temperature change to 1.5 degrees Celsius, NDCs need to cut emissions by 55% below initial pledges by 2030, and we're not quite there yet. But on a positive note, there have been some growing momentum among countries in committing to net zero targets. To date, 58 countries representing over half of global emissions have now committed to net zero emissions by mid-century. However, we're really going to need near-term actions and investments in order to support this transition to net zero. Next slide, please. In addition to missing climate targets, many tropical forest countries are also continuing to experience high levels of deforestation. In fact, primary tropical deforestation increased 12% in 2020, while the rest of the world was slowing down. Deforestation continued on its path, and we lost an area the size of the Netherlands, according to Global Forest Watch data. Despite this increase in deforestation, not all newly submitted NDCs have increased their domestic climate ambition. Brazil is a notable example, who submitted a revised NDC without increasing its ambition and its economy-wide targets, which is a significant gap for the country, as emissions from the agricultural and forest sector make up 60% of Brazil's total emissions. On the other hand, there is some good news. Colombia committed to reducing its emissions 51% below business as usual by 2030 by focusing on the agricultural and forest sectors. It has committed to net zero deforestation by 2030 through focusing on social programs that benefit poor and indigenous communities currently dependent on forests, and is seeking to reduce its GHG emissions from livestock production through improved management and sustainable intensification, including some silvopastoral systems. Next slide, please. So in terms of COVID recovery packages, as countries emerge or start to emerge from the current COVID crisis, they can look to their nationally determined contributions and national climate plans to implement policies that can improve both the economy and the climate, especially for rural communities. For example, countries can look to achieve some of their restoration targets by investing in restoration projects of spent agricultural land. Countries can also achieve land management targets by supporting farmers to increase crop yields through sustainable practices. Countries can also look to provide social protection programs to support sustainable agriculture, as well as indigenous populations for protecting forests. Some examples to date, India channeled about $800 million towards reforestation programs designed to stimulate the rural and semi-urban economies while providing ecosystem benefits. Another example is the European Union, which committed about $17 billion to the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development to help support some rural communities for a more sustainable food system. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. Just finishing up my presentation by saying that national plans still have a ways to go in prioritizing and implementing the right types of forest and nature-based solutions, which can achieve climate change mitigation and adaptation goals while also supporting sustainable development and biodiversity conservation. Forest sector actions have the ability to support many rural populations, but in order for NDCs to achieve these goals, they need to employ participatory rights and rights-based approaches to ensure that rural, indigenous, and local communities have the appropriate support and benefit sharing mechanisms in place. Thank you all, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Paige. Such a great presentation. I wanted to just give 2 comments. One is on how you presented the fact that large-scale afforestation and commodity production system, they are at odds with some of the scenarios for biodiversity. And nevertheless, a great deal of international cooperation of forests have been massively focusing and investing on these kinds of land uses, while agroforestry, for example, is oftentimes not there. And the other elements that we can learn and connect the voluntary approaches that we were talking before with the certifications led by the private sector, they've been having limited effect on hindering deforestation. And it seems that there is a similarity between that kind of voluntary approach led by the private sector with NDCs, which are also voluntary approach led by a global system of governance, and countries are voluntarily presenting what they would be doing. And as you mentioned, we are not on a pathway of keeping healthy, and so there are some elements that we could be bringing to our discussion. And now we prepare to travel from the US to Mexico. So I'd like to introduce you all to Leon Jorge Castanos. He's General Director of Mexico's National Forestry Commission. And his mission is basically to work towards forests for social and climate well-being. So well-being is central here. And in more than 45 years of experience in the sector, he worked in community forestry development, designing public policies, doing research, teaching, and now in the federal government, he's been serving as Director General, as well as Secretariat of Agriculture and Livestock, as Undersecretary of Forestry, and for the Secretariat of Agriculture and Hydraulic Resources, and Executive Secretary of the first National Forestry Commission in the past. So he's been having a lot of experience in the government, and he will bring us some of these experience today, sharing with us in the forum. So Jorge, welcome.
Buenos días y buenas tardes.
Good morning and good afternoon from Mexico. We are going to talk about diverse forests. Mexico has a very great diversity of landscapes due to its orography, its geographical location, its weather conditions. We had a high presence of biodiversity. Nearly 70% of the Mexican territory is covered by some type of vegetation. In the map, you can see in the yellow, the arid and semi-arid areas of the country. In the light green, pine trees. In the dark green, and towards the right-hand side, we have low and high altitude jungles. In purple, the dry jungles or low altitude. And also you can see mangroves, both in the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific. And on the right-hand side, we can see the distribution of the diverse forests. There are 137 million, and how they are distributed. We have the highest arid areas, then temperate forests with 34, high and low altitude jungles at 13, low altitude jungles 16, and arid and semi-arid. How are these spaces managed? We have 3 columns. First of all, we have spaces referring to protected natural areas, 20 million hectares distributed, as you can see in the table.
Sorry to interrupt first slide. ¿Puedes pasar al próximo, por favor? Porque vemos solamente la primera lámina. Muy bien, gracias.
¿Se puede ver ahora?
Can you see it now?
Entonces, en el mapa de la
In the map on the left-hand side, you can see the distribution of the native forests. In yellow, we have semi-arid areas. In light green, pine trees, and so on. In the dark color on the right-hand side, we can see high and medium altitude jungles. In purple, dry jungles. And around the coastal, we have the mangroves. In the table, it's important to see how these spaces are distributed in Mexico. We have 3 columns. What percentage are in protected natural areas, which percentage in authorized forest management, and which on payment for environmental services. When it comes to participation of the forest management is where there is a higher participation. There is tenure of the productive activities and areas which are more directed towards conservation and productive production. And 20 million hectares is where there is less participation from smallholders, since this is part of the government administration. In this map, which is part of the National Forestry Inventory, it's a grid with 25 points, which are measured periodically. And what we can see here in the red spots is where deforestation is taking place in Mexico, which is in the high and medium jungles on the right-hand side, and on the low jungles, and to a lesser extent in temperate forests. Another feature of the country is that we have nearly 11 million people. Mexico is a culturally diverse country with many different indigenous people, and 75% of the indigenous territories are covered by natural vegetation, and 50% is concentrated in the high and medium tropical forests. The cloud forests, 25% of pine forests, and 25% of all the national water production. I'd like to say that of these 15 rural centers, nearly 17% has sustainable forest management in the territory. There are cases from 30 or 40 years ago, and an exceptional one of more than 100 years ago, where community forest management is combined with different activities, where there is timber with payment of environmental services, ecotourism, the production of resin, carbon credits, and other kind of activity, so that the smallholders' economy is made up of a combination of different activities. As a production of this authorized forest management and of all the different hectares of different plantations, the country can only satisfy 25% of its demand. So we're a deficit country when it comes to this, which represents a window of opportunity. I'd like to talk about the federal programmatic framework in order to combat climate change. It is foreseen that forest ecosystems will contribute 22% of the total goal of the reduction of effective greenhouse gas emissions at national level. And 3 programs are created for this: the climate change program, the sector program for environment and natural resources, and the national forest program, which fosters the national strategy for the reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. The strategies in order to face deforestation We have the problem of deforestation, illegal logging, and the increase of the surface, the managed surface. In the case of this deforestation, we have to move from a forest activity vision into a different one that is intersectoral. It is necessary, and we see it day by day, this perspective of a transversality perspective in public actions and policies, and with a territorial-based approach. We also think that the external strategy needs to articulate the subsidies and incentives in the rural areas, not just the forest areas, but also the agriculture secretariat and so on. This is a challenge that requires the articulation of policy and the alignment of incentives. I want to also make reference to the avocado orchards. Mexico exports nearly 2 million tons of avocados from different parts of the country, but this is done with a deforestation and change of the land. In the past, we tried taking advantage of the free trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada, which is more demanding when it comes to the environmental aspects. We're trying to seek coordination between the Environmental Secretariat and the Agriculture one, CONAFOR, in order to include other things aside from the phytosanitary requirements, so that we also include the component that the avocado orchards are deforestation free. Recently, we have tried to seek a joint effort between environment, agriculture, and the producers and exporters associations in Mexico in order to create a regulatory program. Another example, which I think is interesting, in the government of the state of Jalisco, is the launch of the certification brand of responsible tequila agave. So that it's the first alcoholic drink in the world that will have the deforestation-free certification. To this end, the government of Jalisco and CONAFOR are working together in order to create an eligibility map for new agave plantations. This map will be published and will be part of the requirements that the Regulatory Council, the Tequila Regulatory Council, requests for the registration of new plantations. For us, the basic policy is to put people at the center, listen to them, work with them, generate transformational initiatives hand in hand with local communities, indigenous peoples, and those who inhabit those forest territories. In the previous photograph, you can see myself and the chief in the state of Jalisco, a very wise man, which has been linked with nature, and we have learned and worked with him. We are also interested in, and we are promoting, the productive diversification and multifunctional work with private companies through the requirement of funds that will be used for the payment of environmental services and linked with national and international bodies. Lately with mangrove for their restoration and leveraging. And for this reason, from CONAFOR, you can see a photograph of a training to improve technology with the attendance of people from several areas. CONAFOR had staff in the main branches in the capital of each state and in Jalisco. And now we are promoting an initiative so that CONAFOR staff is living near the communities so that we can provide technical advice and support. I'd like to conclude with the following. We have to work on this climate crisis program hand in hand with people, hand in hand with academia, working with the knowledge of communities with the inputs provided by the private sector, with the support of civil society, and with the knowledge of the state governments and the collaboration, so that we can work intersectorally and interinstitutional by the federal public administration. The great change in the last 3 years is exactly that, moving away from the limits of each sector, in our case, the forestry sector, and working hand in hand with the entire environment sector and other institutions that have to do with the rural area. Thank you very much.
Jorge, we will get back in the discussion to talk more about the ejidos, and also I would like to understand better how the local dynamics of policymaking in Mexico is intertwined with international processes like the NDCs, and how do you do the arrangements that would work for Mexico and its population. So I'm calling our next speaker now. So Marie-Ange Kalenga. Marie-Ange, she's normally based in Brussels, I understand, but now in Congo. Thanks for joining us. And this is not your regular déjà vu panel. So all of us, we are sitting around this table virtually, and for the first time together, for at least the 4 of us here. So I'll introduce you to Marie-Ange. She works for Fern, which is based in Brussels, and she joined it in 2014, where she provides advocacy and policy advice and support on forest and climate governance issues and EU development policies impacting forests and forest peoples, with a focus on the Congo Basin. She has over 20 years of experience working in international government and NGOs in the fields of human development and economic governance. She also had contributed to initiatives like the Transparency International, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and Publish What You Pay. She worked on social development, conflict, and human rights issues for the UN Development Programme, Human Rights Watch, and Search for Common Ground. So welcome, Marie-Ange, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thiago, and thank you to Chatham House for inviting Fern to make a presentation on this very important topic. I'm not going to introduce myself again because you did it well, but indeed, I'm based in Brussels and I work for Fern, which is an environmental NGO campaigning for European policies to have a positive impact on forests and forest people. I'm in Kinshasa today, so I apologize in advance if my internet gets a bit unstable at times, but then I'll switch off my camera. So my presentation is going to focus on forest governance and forest governance targets and measures in NDCs in several VPA countries, so tropical forested countries that have signed a voluntary partnership agreement with the European Union. And for those of you who attended the session yesterday morning, you all know, you know everything now about voluntary partnership agreements or VPAs, which are a trade agreement between timber producing countries and the European Union to boost the trade in legally sourced timber. So I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully that will work. Can you see my screen and can you hear me well?
Yes, we can see your presentation, the entire screen.
Okay,
yeah,
excellent.
Perfect,
so my presentation is actually based on a report Fern published earlier this year, assessing how well the NDCs of some VPA countries in Africa had embedded forest measures and forest target, and also looking at how inclusive and the participatory the process for revising or updating these NDCs were. So we've looked at 6 countries. We've looked at Ghana, Liberia, Cameroon, Congo, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But we've also used information and data from our partners in Vietnam, who did a similar study focused on their country's experience. So going back slightly in time at the situation when the first NDCs were submitted ahead of the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, there was really broad consensus that overall the NDCs in the countries I've just mentioned, the NDC elaboration process was quite weak because there was, first of all, a lack of that diverse representation, and local communities and forest-dependent people had not been consulted at all. So it was really just a handful of climate experts and government officials who were really able to take part in the process. We also noticed that there was very limited cross-sectoral coordination at the government level, very little also information that was shared on the leadership of the NDC process and the content of the NDCs themselves, and that the process was really basically limited to the capitals and with very, very little involvement of stakeholders in forest regions or outside of the capital. Of course, the time frame for most of the countries was really, really tight. Some of them had as little as 4 months to develop their NDCs, and finance was really, really not available for most of these countries. In terms of the content, there were also a number of issues because most of the first NDCs lacked qualitative and quantitative indicators on forest, and also lacked a cross-sectoral approach. Their focus was mostly on technical issues and how much efforts they needed to do to reduce their emissions, and issues such as land use, forest governance, community-based solutions were completely, and community rights, human rights and gender were completely sidelined. So we've looked again at these NDCs recently, and we have noticed some improvement. So in terms of participation, there has been yes, a broader stakeholder inclusion. So civil society groups have been more engaged in the revision process. We have also seen that there has been a stronger dialogue between different sectoral ministers. We've also seen that there has been a trend to build on existing processes, such as the VPA process, the RED+ reforms, to involve stakeholders who already had expertise in these mechanisms. And we've also seen that there were efforts to make forest measures more prominent in the NDCs. So zooming in on the situation in all these countries, and particularly in regards to what civil society was expecting to see in this new round of NDCs, we noticed that, again, there have been a lot of process-related challenges, particularly with regards to inclusion of local communities affected by climate change. So there was really almost no consultation, except in the case of, I would say, Congo and maybe Liberia, where consultations happen in forest regions and involve some communities. There is improved CSO engagement, like I said, but that engagement is still not adequate, and there is no formal mechanism to consult CSOs and really to take on board their inputs with very top-down approaches, especially in the case of Vietnam. Unlike the VPA process, we've noticed that there's really not a lot of transparency around what's going on. Civil society is being called to meetings sometimes at the last minute and to comment on documents that are already in the final stages of being being drafted, and that's particularly the case in countries like the Central African Republic and Ghana. And again, we're seeing that the Environment Ministry, which in many of these countries has the lead in updating or revising the NDCs, is still working a little bit in silos. At the same time, we can't deny that there has been progress. Like I said earlier, CSO's engagement has been stronger than in 2015 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I don't know if our colleague is going to join us later. There are plans to set up a formal mechanism to involve different civil society stakeholders and communities. And what I can stress is that civil society in DRC was the only stakeholder group to submit an in-depth contribution to the revision process. And that was really welcomed by the government. In the Republic of Congo, with the help of the Adaptation Action Program, which is funded by Agence Française de Développement, there are plans to step up civil society capacity on climate issues in general. And work is ongoing to set up a kind of CSO climate network building on existing CSO network. And sorry for the typo there. In Vietnam, there has been enhanced information sharing, and there is an MOU between the civil society climate working group and the government, so that civil society input is really integrated into the process. And I would also like to give the examples of the Central African Republic and Liberia, where there is an agreement to hold more consultation outside of the capital, and also clear indicators to beef up participation and consultation, in particular with indigenous groups. So from the process to the content of NDCs, what is the situation today? I mean, what do the NDCs look like? I'm not going to repeat what Paige nicely presented, but just to reemphasize that forest governance issues and community-based solutions are really behind in the current NDCs, and sectors like agriculture and energies are really basically taking the lion's share in terms of priorities. In all of the NDCs we've been looking at, there are limited links between climate action and biodiversity protection, which has been highlighted as a key issues by civil society groups in Ghana and Vietnam, because as the NDCs currently standing might basically encourage more schemes related to restoration in the form of monocultural plantation, which we know is really detrimental for livelihoods and biodiversity. We've also noticed that only 2 countries have included community-based forestry in their NDCs, and looking at the example of Mexico, I mean, most of the countries we've been analyzing are really far from that for a variety of reasons. That would be too difficult to explain here, but a key one is, of course, land tenure regimes. And what we've also seen is that the ambition of increased ambition of these NDCs are often linked to financial commitments from donors to support forested countries in stepping up climate action. So in terms of the contents, we've seen improvements, however. DRC should be commended because it plans to develop a climate law, and hopefully this climate law will build on civil society recommendations in terms of strengthening biodiversity targets and also community-based solutions in the current NDCs. We've also seen that most countries have embarked on major sectoral reforms, including on land use planning, forest and biodiversity. Most of these countries also are working on adaptation plan, which will provide an opportunity to look at resilience issues, and this is the case in Congo and in Ghana. And in the Central African Republic, there is the example of the government committing to mapping forest restoration opportunities, which will hopefully be rights-based and not focused on monoculture plantations. So in terms of our forward-looking recommendations, and that's really from a civil society perspective, but I trust that other stakeholders, government and private sector, might agree with us. The NDC revision must absolutely safeguard the rights of the most vulnerable groups who basically live in these areas that are considered as a rich carbon sinks. And not only the burden, but also the benefits of climate solutions needs to be distributed equitably and fairly. Like mentioned before, it's really important to move away from top-down approaches and to develop climate plans that are rooted in the local context, and that will basically enhance local ownership of the climate plans and NDCs. And in the countries where we've analyzed, there are really processes that provide good lessons learned, not only in terms of participation, but also in terms of cross-sectoral coordination. And finally, that also links to what Paige said, we really want nature-based solutions that are adequate and protect biodiversity while strengthening local livelihoods. This really means moving away from false solutions that basically compensate and maintain status quo in one place while putting a price on nature and forests elsewhere. So you can find more in our report, and I've provided the link in my slides. So I'll stop there. I hope that I haven't used up too much of the time allocated, and thank you again.
Thank you, Marie-Ange, for this overview. And I would endorse both Fern's and WRI analysis, as well as Chatham House's own forest governance website, are very good sources for these kinds of global analysis of forest governance. And yeah, today we decided to work in waves, going from global, having a case study focused in Mexico, back to global, observing dynamics across Africa, Asia. And now the final presentation is from Jose Ilanga, who will focus on the dynamics that's taking place more specifically in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And before moving to our next speaker, I'd like to encourage you all to be populating our Q&A box. So feel free to type in whatever language you feel most comfortable with. But for now, I'd like to invite you, Jose Ilanga, who is Director General of Forests for the Democratic Republic of Congo government. He's a trained agronomist from the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. And since 2007, he's been the coordinating director of the Planning Studies Department at the Ministry of the Environment and Nature Conservation. He also plays a role in the National REDD+ as a National REDD+ focal point, and has extensive experience across Africa and international topics of forest ecosystems, services management, sustainable development, conservation, and biodiversity. So voila, Jose Ilanga, the floor is yours. If you could hear us, I just asked you to unmute. I see you have your hands up. I believe you have to unmute yourself. Or Robin, if you could do that on our end. Yes, welcome. I know you're in the southern hemisphere, but I can see that you're upside down.
C'est bon maintenant, Monsieur Thiago, vous me suivez?
C'est bon.
It's fine now. I think you can hear me now, Tiago. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you, dear colleagues. Our apologies. We experienced some unexpected problems. Despite our will, technology can play tricks on us. I should begin by saying hello, and that I'm very pleased to be with you for this very important meeting organized by Chatham House. First and foremost, I would just like to build on what Tiago has just said. For 10 years, I was the coordinating director of planning, and currently I am the general director of forests for the DRC in the Ministry of Agronomy and Sustainable Development. I see that my image is upside down. Is there any way to rectify this, perhaps?
On est retourné. Ouais. Bon, le temps que mon technicien...
Well, whilst my technician does the necessary, I think that's good now. Once again, I apologize. We're going to move forward a little more quickly and get through the main topics we wanted to present. From what I understand, the main theme of our discussion is what space is allowed for forests and populations who depend on the forest as it relates to land use strategies. I'm very quickly going to present the forest potential of the RDC. I'm also going to present our management approach. We're also going to talk about planning in the rational and sustainable use of forest lands. We will then discuss the issue of forest land use in the DRC. I believe we're going to emphasize the participatory approach of
his microphone issue.
Vous me suivez, Monsieur Thiago? Je peux continuer?
Can you hear me, Tiago? Sorry, can I continue? May I continue? I will continue. If there is a problem, then please just let me know and I will stop. As I was saying, the penultimate point that we will cover today will be interesting to all of you, I believe. That is the involvement of local communities and indigenous peoples in the management of forests in the DRC.
By John Nelson is, could support for the recognition of indigenous and local communities' lands rights over customary lands be one of the indicators towards the achievement of NDCs, or at least progress towards this goal? He has not heard much about rights except for consultations. Who would you like to take on this question first? May I say Paige?
I'm happy to take it. I think you were not, we couldn't hear you at the beginning. And then I think Jose was still talking for a while, so I'm not sure if they're still having issues.
Yes, Tiago, we can still hear Jose talking, and perhaps you could continue with Jose and then we can come back to the question.
Voilà, je continue. Je voulais dire que...
Thank you. So I'll continue. I was saying, for those who do not know, the Democratic Republic of Congo is a forest country. We have a large forest coverage with a surface area of 155 million hectares of forest, and that represents 10% of the world's tropical forest reserves. It's the most dense forest in Africa. And I will anticipate the questions by saying that despite this huge forest potential, our country still does not have a forest policy. So, the dynamics of sustainable management of forest resources in the DRC, we had in 1984 organized a forest symposium on the theme of forest, a national wealth to be preserved. And this set out the main guidelines. And then in 1988, we had another seminar on strategies for ways to integrate the forest sector. And this made it possible to draft the forestry law, which was enacted on the 29th of August 2002. As such, with a concern to clean up the forest sector, the government asked forest concession holders to convert their forest titles based on two conditions. The first condition was that each logger or forestry company in the industrial sector had to ensure that they had a provisional management plan. And that plan had to precede the forest management plan. Another condition for this conversion consisted in negotiating and signing a social clause with local communities, those communities that were close to the forest concessions. And the social clause was a solid promise vis-a-vis the local communities in terms of socio-economic investment, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of cultural infrastructure, in terms of socio-economic infrastructure. Therefore, this is where we saw that the forest sector needed to be called upon to sign an agreement. There is an environmental dimension here, but also a social dimension to logging in our country. And the law that I mentioned earlier on brought about a lot of innovation. And among all of this innovation, I will just mention a few because we don't have much time. What we must take away from this is that the law establishing the forest code in the DRC is innovative and did bring about many innovations in environmental innovations, but also social innovations. Why social? Well, the law provides for, in all forest discussions, consultation platforms. And those platforms involve all stakeholders. And the stakeholders here may be forestry departments, agricultural departments, mining ministries, oil ministries, and also civil society, an important component. Development partners, those that provide funding, those that provide expertise, they are all part of these stakeholders. And then finally, we have forestry companies from the private sector. So it's innovative, it's a decision that is taken for logging, but also for sustainable resource management. But for that decision to be taken, there is prior consultation. Not only do we have their involvement, but also the forestry code allowed for the implementation of consultation platforms, as I said, to talk about forest concerns, to talk about how to categorize forest concessions, to talk about forest policy, to talk about the decisions that must be taken as it relates to the development of plantations. And at the national level, we have what we call national forest advisory boards. And these boards involve all of these stakeholders who are all based in Kinshasa, the capital, where all of the Republic's institutions are. The advisory boards are provincial, so at the level of the forests, and we find delegates from those stakeholders. So it includes the grassroots. All of this to say that for this major decision to be taken as it relates to deforestation or forest regulations, none of these decisions can be taken exclusively within the Central Forestry Department, but rather all stakeholders are involved. I wanted to really emphasize this point.
So in our country, and thanks to our forest code and our new law, we have this important involvement, which means that all of the decisions are taken involving all of the stakeholders and all of the vulnerable groups, including women and indigenous people. It was also asked of us, and let me say that briefly, during the rational and sustainable use of lands. This was done through what we call forest zoning. This zoning simply is distributing parts of some lands on a district or on a province and dedicated to forest resources, industrial, small scale or community activities, because in our country we have different categories of forests. We have permanent forests, so this is for industry activities. We have artisanal or small scale, and we have community activities, and these forests are accessed by the communities so that they can use them for logs as well as any other forest resources. So in my country, what do we understand by zoning? Well, it needs to focus on harmony and development in all of the sector, because we don't just talk about permanent production forests. There are also different categories of forests, i.e. conservation areas. And in these conservation areas, you can find protected areas, and the DRC currently has a network of parks, of hunting grounds, and of natural reserves, which amounts to 13% of our national territory. And the DRC committed to the Nagoya Declaration and wants to reach 17% instead of 13% for these areas. And then the third category are protected forests, and they can be re-affected or not, and partially or totally, to other activities such as logging or cooking, for example. So the use of forest lands, as you can see, I think it is the same elsewhere in the world. Well, we have a difficulty here. Even if we have developed many of our national plans for permanent protection forests and protected areas or conservation areas, we still have the same problems of competition between forest resources and other types of resources, including oil, mining, and others, and maybe land-based resources. So, how do we organize ourselves? Well, of course, we have consultation platforms. This is the case for the National Advisory Council for zoning. To facilitate these areas, we need to work with this board, which is controlled by the ministry. And there are others which are directed and led by other sectors. We need to affect some of our land nationally to logging, to conservation, to protection, rather than focusing on oil production or gas production or land-based activities. So this concept is ongoing. And the nationally led plans, well, we have a land use and land development ministry, and today they have produced a national land use plan, which focuses on the affectation of resources and the use of resources in the DRC. And some areas are focusing on industrial logging or oil mining, or others. So this minister leads all of these processes nationally, and other ministries, including the Ministry of Forest, is included in some of these main commissions and committees so that we can hear the local communities' voices, as well as the industrial loggers' voices, as well as the conservation network through the Congolese territory.
Sorry to interrupt. I would like to bring one of the questions by the audience. We're approaching the final 20 minutes for the session. And one of the questions has to do with these aspects of consultation and the participation of the rural populations. And I would like to bring those so you can engage with some of these elements. I would like to call first John Nelson, and then I would like to call next Mega IUL and Luis Nakagawa, both for the next round. But if John Nelson is still online, would you please speak up?
Oh, hi there.
Hi.
Hi, yeah, no, just John Nelson here. My question was really around rights to land, and that actually process towards helping local people, local communities, indigenous peoples secure rights to their customary lands could be part of an NDC, an indicator towards progress towards NDC. It's just a general question to everyone with their different perspectives. Thanks.
Who would like to take on that? Paige?
Yeah, I can speak generally to it. Yes, that's definitely a possibility. When a paper that I co-authored in 2019 before the Madrid COP, we laid out a couple options for different kinds of targets. And one of the non-greenhouse gas targets that countries can include in their NDC would be an area of land with secured land tenure for indigenous peoples or local communities. You could also include specific policies that would help indigenous and local communities secure rights. So I haven't reviewed all of the new NDCs yet, but I haven't seen anything. Maybe my co-panelists could speak to specific examples, but yes, definitely the encouragement of specific targets and policies to support indigenous peoples in the NDCs is definitely something we're advocating for.
Would anyone else like to tackle this question? Leon?
En el caso de México,
in the case of Mexico, we had an agrarian reform in the last century, in 1920 to 1940, and all the lands were distributed to the agrarian places and smallholders. After that, in 1980, there was a change in forestry policy, whereby we moved from concessions to private companies, long-term concessions, where the landowners were marginalized. And then a change of legislation took place so that the right to the use of the land or the forest and its productive part went into the hands of smallholders. At the time in Mexico, this agrarian reform and forestry reform guarantees that both rural areas and the communities of those indigenous areas have the right to those lands and to the direct usage of those forests.
I'd like to ask Mega IUL to come next, and potentially Marie-Ange and Jose to respond to the question Mega is raising. Mega, can you to, thank you.
All right. So basically, I just want to know the point of view of the panelists about how do we ensure this path, to all the stakeholders to really put their attentions in which we know that they should have been their attention and, promote the political will and the political action toward a synergized forest management, align that with the NDCs that they already proposed. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mega. Marie-Ange.
Yeah, in my presentation, I alluded to the VPA process, which involves an inclusive group of stakeholders from civil society, communities, private sector, and government. And that's really a place where you can build synergies around sustainable forest management and inclusive forest management. So we really encourage climate officials to look at lessons learned and at the processes that the VPAs have been able to promote and to set up to use it as a model to inspire conversation around climate change. So that's at least something that we are recommending in VPA countries. In non-VPA countries, there might be other processes from which NDC stakeholders could build on, possibly REDD+ processes, or maybe land use planning reforms, but that really depends very much on the context. But again, we want to reiterate that sort of deliberative approach to also defining climate action is really crucial to build solid countrywide ownership and inclusion of groups that live in areas that are going to be sort of used to increase carbon sinks and reduce emissions.
Interesting, Marie-Ange. José Langa.
Merci. Je crois.
Thank you.
Effectivement, avec les retards que nous avons pris, nous sommes pas rentrés trop.
Yes, of course, we were a bit late, so I didn't manage to go into detail, but I wanted to reassure a previous speaker from earlier that the initiative is not a bad one. We've heard about the VPAs, etc. These initiatives do exist, yes, but I think that the best way that we can place people at the center of our concerns, the community, local populations, at the center of sustainable and rational management of forest resources. Well, the best way to do so is that this is enshrined in law. And from that point onwards, even before we have a law, we can have a forest code such as the one we have, but we need a forest policy with a clear vision. Yes, I said it earlier. The DRC doesn't really have a forest policy yet, but the process is ongoing. And through this type of policies, we can have a clear vision of the country on what it wants to achieve and what it wants to do with its forest resources and with whom it wants to partner to manage forest resources. And this is what we want to see once this type of act is acted. Then we can say that the forest resources cannot just be managed by donors or by governments only, but through the involvement of all stakeholders through consultation platforms. And then we will have a win-win situation, and all of the stakeholders will be included, communities, indigenous people, etc. And all of them will find their own rights, and this will be more sustainable than a law that favors a certain initiative or a certain process in terms of sustainable management of forest resources.
Two questions have to do with international cooperation. And I'll invite Teodil Nikuinchua to speak up, and also Louise Nakagawa. And I'll take the opportunity to introduce you all to Louise. Louise is one of the key partners of Chatham House role with SEBRAPI and other policy institutes in Indonesia and DRC on our forest governance research. So if I can invite you both, Louise and Teodil, to raise your question live, please.
Okay, should I go first? This is Teodil from WRI Congo.
Thank you, Teodil.
Thank you so much for the great presentations. I wonder, I mean, my questions have to do with finance. I wonder whether countries have put in place robust checks and balances to ensure that the funding allocated to the NDCs are properly managed, because we are talking of millions of dollars in each country. So I think we have not, I wonder if panelists have tips, suggestions that could be put in place to make sure that that finance is properly managed. But the most important part is also to make sure, I'm wondering if we can shift the way we think about it, communities just as beneficiaries, and get funding trickling down to them, as because they will be expected to play a role, a game changer role. They are supposed to play a role in mitigating climate change. How do we make sure that they receive some part of the finance allocated to achieving the NDCs in the countries? Over. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tiago, for this opportunity to put my question. Yeah, it's very clear. It's undoubtedly that we have those efforts to improve, to implement and develop all the mechanisms and all the instruments to reduce, to minimize, or to address the problems in terms of the burn and slash and the deforestation issues. But I'm wondering, how could the international institutions and organizations could address or deal the problems in terms of the conflicts, the violence against indigenous populations, also traditional communities, settlers, in terms of to face the land grabbing problem? I mean, in Brazil, this is a very a huge problem. So I would like to understand in terms of how could the international organizations could address this or deal with this? Thank you.
Any volunteer?
I can, yeah, go ahead, Mariangela.
No, go ahead, I'll go after you.
I was like, these are two great questions that we don't have great answers to at this time. But I think in general, I think that it's important to, both the, rural indigenous communities, supporting them will also support all of these forest actions. So I think it's important just to emphasize that these are just mutually reinforcing benefits that we can provide. And I think one of the key things is law enforcement, and because so much deforestation is still illegal, and obviously the harming of indigenous communities is right at the front lines of that. So one thing to answer Louis' question is just increased law enforcement capabilities, which kind of leads into governance strategies, which is another one of the key issues that Teodil was bringing up. But I'll stop there and let other panelists add on.
Oui, je vais répondre en français à Théodile.
I'm going to answer in French for Teodil. So, for issues of transparency and accountability in climate sciences, I'm very pleased to announce to you that Fern has also conducted a study on the issue. This study will be published around September this year. The recommendations, the main recommendations, are first and foremost to improve access to information and to establish transparency for climate science. It seeks to protect the forests and to restore forests as well. The information we have available is very sparse at the moment. We do not know what the volume that comes from international donors. We don't know what volume of funds come from forest countries. And so it is very important for us to have greater aggregation of the information. This is not an easy task. Second recommendation, also an important recommendation, we need to improve transparency by implementing mechanisms, whistleblowing systems, and this is linked to Louise's concern. So we need a denunciation system that could highlight and signal any issues of corruption, which is a scourge in climate science. So that report will soon be available, and we are looking forward to be able to share that.
One last question, this one directed to Leon Jorge. And then I would like to have a general question for all of you, since in 60 minutes, more or less, we are approaching the end in the final session on for this year. And I would like to ask you all to just give one hint or one recommendation for the future work that you wanted to be putting forward that can be fed into the next panel. But before moving to this final words from all of you, I'd like to ask Leon Jorge, what is the role of community forestry in the planning in Mexico? And yes, I'm picking one of the questions here from Luciana. And yeah, what would be the situation with the ejidos? And what would you like to tell us about this kind of land use strategy?
Bueno, en México, la política.
In Mexico, the policy recognizes that property in Mexico is predominantly collective, whether it's through ejidos or agrarian communities who work with an assembly system and a steering group. From the last century, forestry policy has centered around in supporting the development of agrarian areas in the country. And I said in my presentation that we have 5.5 million hectares which are under legalized usage. And our target for 2024 is to reach or to increase in 2 million hectares the area of forest management, for which we have identified in the whole area of native forests or diverse forests, which ones are areas that don't have that usage, or areas which are natural protected areas where the usage is restricted and the use of timber is restricted. We have identified these areas. What we are doing is, once these spaces are identified, these potential spaces, which features and which needs do they have in terms of social and economic needs? And the second step is what we said. We have to move from the law to the operative part. And we have taken a step of moving the personnel on site near the communities so that these groups are working side by side with the agrarian groups, identifying what their problems are, which are the market needs, and so that they can create a development program. And it's also very important to consider the financing part, for which we are knocking on the door of the development bank in the country, private financing, and even international financing, so that all these parts, the technical assistance, market, they can all come together and bring all of these into reality, the incorporation of these 2 million hectares. To sum up, for Mexico, the common community forestry policy is essential, and it's part of the actions that our institution has gone for. I also wanted to mention, if you allow me, a concern in Mexico, which is the loss of prices in the harvesting of drugs. That means that the groups that we're involved in this activity have moved to forestry. And I found in the usage of timber, they have found the possibility of income. Organized criminal groups who are also located in Mexico, and at country level, it has been realized that the issue of security and organized crime is too big for the forestry industry, and the Secretariat of Environment has, with the support of the executive of the president, has asked so that other entities in the country that deal with public security and defense, with finance intelligence, so that they can all participate, and in that way a working group has been created so that this program can be dealt with, especially in the areas where organized crime is present. What will happen, I don't know, but I think this step, jumping from forestry to the environment in order to solve problems, I think that is the right way. Thank you very much.
Dynamics and the interwovenness of all of these issues. So we're approaching the very end of this panel. I would like to start with you, Paige. What would be your one recommendation for the future so we can achieve climate, planetary, humanitarian ambitions?
Yes, this is a little bit response to James' question, so I can get that into, but my one suggestion is really getting the rules and the safeguards right about these voluntary carbon markets in order to tap into the private sector finance that is rearing to go and to put money into these solutions. But in order for the finance to be equitably shared and get to the people on the ground, the rules and the safeguards around these types of markets and solutions need to be clarified and codified in the appropriate places. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Paige. Jose Langa, are you still there with us? Otherwise, I'll ask Marie-Ange.
Yes, so my sort of main takeaway would be to reiterate the importance of broad ownership of climate processes, of NDC processes. It's only by including all stakeholders around the table that we will be able to achieve and to devise positive solutions to climate change that work not only for nature, but also for people. So linking to what Paige said, it's really important that the rights and the biodiversity and livelihood dimensions are more strongly integrated in debates and policies around climate change. And yes, it's a plea also to decarbonize the debate, because carbon is still something very virtual for local communities. So they really want to see an improvement in their livelihoods, and they want to see that the environment they live in is protected.
Indeed.
Thanks.
Jose Langa, your final message, or what we should be focusing next.
Effleuré par tous les panélistes, je crois
Well, I think that climate change is an evidence. It's something that's definitely going to happen. It's the main concern of all forest countries, such as the DRC. these countries must take account of this. The proof of this is that aside from the initiatives that have been launched, in particular the national RED strategies to try to stop the phenomenon of deforestation, our country is ready to revise the forest code to attach greater importance to climate change. And the actions that will be undertaken do require great resources. This is why the high institutions of the country are asking for the assistance of the international community to try to fund some of the efforts that have been made by the DRC. And as a conclusion, I would say that it's a scourge that preoccupies us all. But in the DRC, the provisions as it relates to the laws, as it relates to initiatives such as RED, VPA, FLEGT, and all of that, those initiatives have already been taken. And the countries are not demanding, but are asking for assistance and support at the international level, at the sub-regional level too. Thank you very much.
And last but not Leon Jorge, your final words for now. What would be one recommendation you'd like to put forward?
The forestry sector moves away from its own traditional limits and is linked with environment and with other institutions in order to resolve the issues of the market.
Okay, thank you very much, each of you, Marie-Ange, Paige, Leon Jorge, Jose Langa, Charlotte, Allison, and all the crew. Thank you so much for making this happen. And I hope to see you all in about 1 hour when Allison will be chairing our final panel for these forums for this year. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Merci. Gracias. Ciao.